Good evening or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Mel Bishop. I'm an Associate Professor at Maquarie University in Sydney, Australia, and I also co-lead the Green Engineering Working Group of the World Harbour Project, along with Laura Airoldi, who's at the University of Bologna. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you tonight to our webinar on green engineering. And tonight we're going to hear from three great speakers who have been heavily involved in the World Harbour Project network. And so the subject of tonight's webinar is really, I guess, green design in the marine environment. So I guess historically we've seen lots of artificial structures being built in marine environments for all kinds of purposes. And the concept of green engineering, or some people refer to it as eco-engineering, is actually designing structures not just for their intended purpose in terms of protection of coastal property from storm surge or aquaculture or recreational benefits, but also to minimise their ecological impacts as well, and actually, to the contrary, to enhance their ecological values. So tonight we're going to hear about, I guess, a number of different approaches to this topic. And so why is this such an important topic? Well, the coastal zone is very much the centre of human population growth around the world. So we've now got more than 40% of the global population that's living within 100 kilometres of the coastline. And over 60% of our major cities are within this zone as well. And so with these human populations comes all kinds of development of the coastal environment. And so what we're seeing more and more is the introduction of all kinds of artificial structures into this space for purposes such as protecting coastal property from storm surge and erosion, I guess recreational infrastructure, so pontoons, pilings, mooring buoys. We're seeing aquaculture infrastructure. More and more we're seeing, I guess, renewable energy generation moving into the marine environment with offshore wind farms and wave-generated energy. And so we're seeing this real proliferation of artificial structures in this space. In some cases, we might be able to be smart about, I guess, when and where we do need these structures. So in some cases, for example, coastal protection, you know, we might want to think about, well, instead of building a seawall, can we in fact restore natural habitat to protect our coastlines? But in other instances, the introduction of these artificial structures is going to be inevitable. And so what we're going to be focusing on tonight, or this morning, depending on where you are, I guess is where we are introducing these artificial structures. How can we do that to enhance their ecological values and minimise the, I guess, the collateral damage that might otherwise occur? And so the first of our speakers tonight is going to be Louise Firth. And Louise Firth is a lecturer in environmental sciences at Plymouth University. She is an ecologist there, and she's really interested in testing hypotheses about how heterogeneity and complexity influence the function of ecosystems and ecological communities. And Louise has been doing quite a lot of work on how can we perhaps design artificial structures such as breakwaters and seawalls so that they include some of the habitats that we might see on natural shorelines that are actually not present on these artificial structures. So she's going to speak to us first about some of the work she's been doing on incorporating rock pools into these structures. Second of all, we've got Ido Sella, who is one of the founders of EocEngineering, and so he's a professional biologist with masters and PhDs in zoology from Tel Aviv University. And EocEngineering has really been at the forefront of, I guess, innovation in concrete products to use in ecologically sustainable marine structures. And so he's going to be talking to us a bit about what we can do in the way of the composition of concrete in order to enhance its ecological sustainability. And then our third speakers tonight, so we've got a team of two, so Dave Lennon and Alex Goad from Reef Design Lab, which are a Melbourne-based company that actually designed the tiles that some of you that are online have been using in the World Harbour Project. And so they're going to talk about, I guess, some of the design features that we might think about when we're either retrofitting things like seawalls with habitat enhancing structures, or if we're designing artificial reefs. So what I'd like to do now is hand over to Louise, and Louise is going to kick off our program tonight. So thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Mel. Yes, I'm going to present some work on behalf of a much wider team, and I'm going to specifically focus on what we've done in relation to creating artificial rock pools on coastal infrastructure. And I'm going to talk to you tonight, or today, about 3 specific case studies. So, as Mel had already explained, there's a lot of artificial structures that are proliferating in the marine environment, and people are referring to this as ocean sprawl. Typically, these structures are fairly featureless, like this image here on the top right. It looks like rock revetment, very little living on it, very few microhabitats that are important for marine life, like crevices, rock pools, and pits. Also, we're seeing a lot of concrete that's going into the marine environment. Ido is going to talk to us a lot more about that. And typically, these structures can form these dollus units here in this image, or these shed-type units here on a causeway in Galway Bay. We're also seeing a lot of seawalls being created, and typically these are featureless and often support very low diversity and can sometimes be characterized by non-native species. Irrespective of whether you place something in the intertitle or the subtitle, it will become colonized. And these structures can, in fact, be managed to provide what we call valuable ecosystem services. So they can be managed to provide good for humanity. We all know that artificial reefs have been around for a very long time to enhance fisheries, for example, in this top left image here. This top right image here is showing you some mussels. In fact, these are non-native species in Florida that are supporting high densities of barnacles. Both species are biofilters, and they're filtering pathogens and all sorts of dirt out of the water, providing a very important service. Many structures can actually support very high biodiversity, and biodiversity can be quite important for a number of different functions. And wreck diving, of course, is another money-making option for lots of people in lots of local communities. And often artificial structures are sunk on purpose to enhance the biodiversity in the local area and to attract fish, and they can be used in terms of providing cultural ecosystem services. So just to move back to intertidal artificial structures, where I'm going to be talking about in my 3 case studies, we all know that rock pools are interesting environments. Many of you, I'm sure, will have spent lots of time as kids, or maybe you do spend time now with your kids rock pooling for fun. This image here just shows you a very small rock pool. It's about 6 or 7 centimeters wide. It's only about 5 centimeters deep. And it's actually on an artificial structure. It's on Plymouth breakwater here in Plymouth. And even though it's such a small rock pool, you can see that there's a limpet, there's 2 species of anemone, 5 individuals, and there's at least 5 species of algae in this rock pool. The point I'm trying to make is that rock pools even very small rock pools can support very diverse communities. This, of course, is common knowledge. We all know that rock pools are very diverse environments compared to adjacent emergent rocks. But we were interested in actually testing this hypothesis in relation to artificial environments as well as natural. And the bar chart here on the right shows you we've got artificial environments, these first 4 locations here, and then we've got natural sites here, these other 4. On the y-axis, we have mean species richness. The pool habitats are represented by the grey bars, and the rock habitats are represented by the white bars. And in all situations, at all sites, the rock pools supported significantly greater species richness than the emergent rock. And this appeared to be particularly important. The magnitude of the effect was greater in artificial environments than it was in natural. So taking this information and knowing this as it was common knowledge, G. Chapman really was the pioneer in relation to creation of artificial rock pools in intertidal environments. And she sort of led the field of eco-engineering rock pools on the Sydney seawalls. I won't go into much detail about what she did, but these 2 papers here in Ecologia and Environmental Science and Technology are really good examples of novel ways that you can create artificial rock pools on seawall habitats. So building on this, we were really interested as a team to actually take this pioneering work done by G and actually trial it in different scenarios, particularly on rock revetments. So the first thing that we came up with to create artificial rock pools, we called the Bioblock. So the Bioblock here, as you can see, is a precast concrete habitat enhancement unit. And on the horizontal surface here, you can see these are rock pools of differing diameters, but also differing depths. So there's 4 different types here. On 2 of the opposing vertical sides here, we created these ledges, okay, which not only increased surface area, but created overhangs as well as ledges. And then on the other 2 opposing sides, we had these little pits of 2 different depths. The idea behind the Bioblock was that it could replace any given boulder in any given coastal defence, either during the construction period or retrospectively. And the idea behind it was that it had multiple habitat types to support biodiversity. So this was placed into a coastal defence structure in North Wales back in 2012, and we monitored colonisation over the next year, over 12 months. And irrespective of whatever time of year it was, the Bioblock represented in blue always supported greater total species richness than the surrounding boulders here represented in red. But remember, there were lots of different habitat types. This graph here shows you the dark bars here are effectively the 4 different pool habitats. We've got our ledges here, the deep pits, the shallow pits, and then we also looked at the surrounding boulders as well on horizontal but also vertical faces. There's 10 species on the Bioblock and there's only 4 on the surrounding boulders. But if you look at when you actually pull it out in terms of the different habitat types, we expected that the big deep pools would support the greatest diversity, but they only actually supported 5 species. So this number creating the real difference between the 2 was actually a component of the variety of habitats rather than any one specific habitat type. So the next case study, we wanted to create artificial rock pools by actually drilling them directly into the breakwater, into this breakwater here, Towan in mid-Wales. Now this work really was led by Dr. Ali Evans, who was a PhD student at the time. She's now a postdoc at the University of Southampton. And the idea behind this was that we got contractors in to drill artificial rock pools into the horizontal surfaces of boulders on the coastal defence in Towan. So Ali monitored this over time, over 18 months in fact, and these hashed lines here represent the mean species richness, so the mean total number of species, so the mean species richness in the rock pools themselves here, represented by the circles, and also on the surrounding boulders here represented by the squares. And as you can see, again, after a certain period of time, after about 6 months, the pools were always supporting greater richness than were the surrounding boulders. If we then look at the cumulative richness, so this is every new species that was accumulating over time, the boulders here effectively tapered off after about 12 months. But if you look at the pools themselves, over time they kept accumulating new species. So every time Ali went back to survey, there were new species colonising her pools every single time. And this never tapered off, even after 30 months. We were also interested in looking at the community composition in the pools, and we were comparing these to natural pools, natural rock pools on natural rocky shores. And these are the Towan rock pools here, so these are the artificial ones, and these 3 different shapes here represent 3 different locations nearby to the structure in Wales. And as you can see here, the artificial rock pools are separating out as very different in terms of the identity, but also the relative abundances of the species. Indicating that although they were similar in terms of diversity, they were completely different in terms of the makeup of the species in the communities. Thankfully, I'm very proud to say that there's a really nice legacy from Ali's work. In October 2014, Ali was awarded the winner of the most innovative prize at the Syria Big Challenge Awards. Syria is a body in the UK that basically communicates research to the construction industry. In addition to being awarded a prize, Ali's work was actually taken up into the Syria guidelines, which is a really nice impact for this research. Subsequently, myself and Dr. Suyan Shi here, who's also a World Harbour Project partner, we've taken Ali's work and we've replicated it in Malaysia at 3 different locations. And the idea behind this is to really test the efficacy of the technique in a tropical setting, which is something we don't necessarily know how that's going to work. The third case study I want to present to you is where we created artificial rock pools using concrete. This was the system that we were working in. It's a causeway with these artificial concrete units in Galway Bay, Ireland. And as you can see, you've got really nicely controlled shore heights and obviously lots and lots of replicates of these units. If you look inside these units, this is what they effectively look like. There's rock armouring underneath in the core, and then we poured concrete in on top of this. As it was setting, we placed these buckets in, made sure that they made depressions in the concrete, removed them after the concrete had set, and effectively they retained water and functioned like rock pools. We had a really nice situation where the causeway went out perpendicular to the shore, so we had an exposed side and a sheltered side. And of course, we also had a lower, we had treatments on the low shore, but we also had them on the upper shore. We placed our units up here, so this is where we created the rock pools. This was above mean high water spring, so we really were not expecting much to happen up here. We were not expecting many species to colonize. And our hypotheses were that the exposed side would support greater richness than the sheltered side, and also that the lower side would, or the lower pools would support greater richness than the upper shore. The results surprised us a little bit. First of all, the sheltered side completely filled up with sand, and they effectively failed to function as rock pools altogether. They were soft sediment environments, really. But on the exposed side, we got some really quite interesting results. We separated the results out into taxon or functional richness, and we were surprised to find that looking at mean taxon richness, there was no significant difference between the lower pools and the upper pools. There was a significant difference between lower and upper in functional richness. This was really surprising because, like I said, the pools on the upper shore were really high up, and we were really not expecting much to colonize them. So when we separated out the pools into the number of pools here on the x-axis versus the total richness, you can see here that after about 10 pools, the upper pools really just petered out in terms of the number of species that was colonizing them. The opposite was true of the lower pools. Every additional pool was supporting at least one new species. And then this is indicating that if you're going to create rock pools, higher up on the shore, about 10 in this situation would be sufficient. But maybe, depending if you're trying to capture rare species, you need to keep going on the lower shore. When we separated out into the various different functional groups, we wanted to see where, which habitats were supporting unique species. So the blue bars here represent those that were unique to the lower shore. The white represent those that were common to both the upper and the lower, and the red represents those that were unique to the upper shore only. And as you can see, all groups had many more unique species in the lower shore than the upper shore. There are actually only 4 different groups that had species that were unique to the upper shore at all. And then things like carnivores, for example, were only present on the lower shore. So, in conclusion, I think from the range of options that are now available, we can conclude that artificial rock pools do support diverse communities, but Ali's work certainly showed that they may not be functionally equivalent to natural rock pools. Eco-engineering in general is a valuable tool, but we certainly are not advocating that people go out and drill and pour concrete all over the place creating rock pools. People need to consider the environmental setting and whether they actually really want to even enhance biodiversity at all, or are rock pools even something that you want to be creating at all. We do have lots of options available to managers now, and thankfully, based on the brilliant work that's been done of late, managers are now being faced with a bit of a toolkit and options available to them. And finally, I think it's important to point out that eco-engineering is great. We're all doing a lot of great work in this, but I think it's important that we need to be careful to advise people who are going to be using it to avoid it being used as a bit of a ploy to get green light on harmful developments. We know quite a lot about certain environments, and particularly in the temperate zone. We know relatively little about the tropics. Lots of things have been going on, where people have tried things that failed. I think it's important that people report this. And then moving on from this, I think, yes, we've done a lot of work on a very small scale, and this is shown to be quite effective. But we need to really think about the bigger picture and move forward and considering an ecosystem approach. So thank you for everyone for listening. I'm going to hand over to Ido now, and I guess we're going to have time for question and answer after this. Thank you.
So, thank you, Louise. Following Louise's talk, which was a great introduction to what we're doing, is what I'm going to discuss today is how we went from research, but then closing the gap into large-scale projects, and how you implement the knowledge that you have from trials in the sea and in the lab, and implement them with the industry. So I think that the introduction was done better than I by Louise, and I think what's more important, and I think is the take-home message, is that if we look at the coastal waters, which are 100 kilometers from the shoreline, it occupied 60% of the world population, and it's actually taking only 15% of the land surface. And this area is populated by massive infrastructure, and we're going to see accelerated coastal development with increased storminess and with the sea level rise prediction. So those infrastructures are starting from transportation and going into residential, but we see it all over the world, and I think we see it more and more affected by storms in the last 20 years. And 70% of those infrastructure are concrete-based, and that's the reason we focused on concrete initially. And there's usually what we see with concrete are two separate case studies, and I think it's related to what Louise said about tropical environment. So if we just put our head in the water, usually what we see that in temperate environments, we see that concrete structures do colonize, but we see lower biodiversity. And in tropical environments, where most of the time see that concrete structures are sometimes don't even get a cover of biology, and if they see, and if there are colonization, it's done by species which grow fast and die fast. And for example, here on the left-right side, we can see a concrete cube that stayed more than 25 years in the tropical environment of the Red Sea, and it's covered by 2 species of corals. And you can't compare. This is the most diverse ecosystem in the world, and we don't see that biodiversity on the concrete. On the other hand, we see an image from the freshwater of the Great Lakes, and something similar can be found in other temperate environment, where the entire concrete wall is covered by few species, but those are usually species that grow fast, die fast, or invasive species that actually colonize an area which other cannot colonize. And the reason that concrete is not a poor substrate for balanced biological communities is both by design and material. So most of concrete structures and infrastructure have a lot of vertical relief, very low complexity, and the use of concrete, which is so massive, affected biology, and this is something that we test, and this is what I'm going to discuss. Our goal is to try to make the biodiversity that we see and the biological communities that we see on infrastructure, and in this talk I'm focusing on concrete-based infrastructure, as much as we can to the natural ecosystem nearby. So our control will be always natural reefs, which are in the vicinity of those infrastructure. And what we're trying to do is promote a biogenic buildup, and actually the growth of a biological layer on top of this, on those structures, and making sure that the biodiversity of this layer is sufficient, that will have the same ecosystem services as the natural reef, and that will have a good ratio, or let's say a better ratio of invasive species to native species than we see on standard infrastructure. And so there's biological advantages, but there's also structural advantages, and this is why the industry is so interested in creating this situation, is because biology give benefits to the structural benefits. It can be strength, it can be reduce erosion of the of the structure, if it's from fluoride penetration into the concrete, and which affect the rebar inside, or the changes in temperature, the daily changes in temperature between night and day that might create cracks with time on the structures. So even the industry have now an ambition to see this situation come to light. And I'm going to discuss how we started and how we moved from experiments in the lab and in the sea into actual infrastructure. And we actually started from the concrete. So when we decided we're going to tackle concrete, we sat with concrete engineers, and we isolated around 25 different concrete mixes which comply with the requirements from marine construction. After testing them in the lab, do preliminary work in the lab and in the field, we isolated 5 of them that we suspected would be the better and perform better than others. And we went into a large scale experiment where we compared those 5 matrices into a standard Portland cement mixed matrix, which is widely used with the industry. During that time, we did all the testing for structural performance, from compressive strength and water pressure penetration and fluoride penetration, which are the standard ASTM tests that you run on concrete and is required by the industry. And as always, we you start with tiles, and that's what we did. And we cast tiles from those 5 different matrices, and from a control that was made from Portland cement. Each tile has had a smooth side and a texture side, and the texture was, we had a 2-level texture, which is what provided us with the 2 complexity levels, and it was randomly made. So we had the same complexity, but it wasn't a design that we tested, it was the complexity that was tested. So each tile, although they had the same complexity, had provided different niches, but overall the mean complexity levels were the same. And we tested those experiments in both tropical and temperate environments. In each site, we ran field experiments where units were placed at a depth of 6 to 10 meters and was monitoring for 3, 6, and 12 months. This is for publication, but in most of the station, we even extended to almost 2.5 years of survey, and we checked live cover and species richness, biomass, and chlorophyll. And on the same time, at each site, we ran experiments, lab experiments with local species, and we collected larvae of corals and bryozoans and placed them in vials and did actually testing of the mix itself in an isolated environment with 1 species at a time. And those tests was run at 8 different stations. So we had 2 tropical stations. One was in the Red Sea in Israel. The other one was in Key West, Florida. Sorry. We had a temperate station that was in the Mediterranean, in the East Mediterranean, in the city of Ashdod in Israel, in Savannah, Georgia, on the east coast of the U.S., and around New York. We had 3 stations around New York City. And we had 1 station which was on the Great Lakes, which was a freshwater station that we didn't even knew what we're going to get there, but because we worked with NOAA, which is a federal entity, and they asked us to test the technology there, we went there with blind eyes. And I'm going to discuss this in the beginning, in the next few minutes. What we saw initially, and this is the same image that we usually see, that we saw in all of the stations, there was a different community structure among the stations, and in this case we compare the Red Sea station to the Mediterranean station, and there was a shift. There was temporal patterns within each station where the community shifted, which is something that we predict and is in line with the succession that process that is done on a new substrate that you put into the water. What was very interesting that in most of the station and most of the time and during the process, there was a clear separation of the matrices the different matrices that we use in terms of the biodiversity that I show and the community structure, and Portland cement-based mix. And the Portland cement-based mix tiles actually presented a different, completely different set of species than the other matrices. And this was also shown on the lab experiments. So here are 3 different experiments that we run with soft corals, with Dendronephia hemprichae and Anthropocene fusiensis, and with bryozoans, Bubula neratina. And what you can see here is that in each of the experiments, Portland cement-based mix had the lower recruitment than all the others. When we run the same experiment in New York with oysters, with oyster spat, we saw a similar trend, but something quite surprising. First of all, Portland didn't even recruited, but 2 different mixes, which were M4 and M1, recruited much better than all the others. And this is something that we later implemented in 2 different projects in the area. And the same trend was also shown on the plates that were in situ. Regarding the surface complexity, so we of course saw, like all the other research, that there is a huge effect of the complexity of the tile on the biology that develop on it. And in all stations, the complex side and the texture side presented more rich biodiversity. Accumulation of calcium carbonate was higher, also chlorophyll, than the smooth side. The only place that it was crystal clear was in the Great Lakes, and it was clear because what we saw there is that an invasive species which colonized most of the Great Lakes, which is the zebra mussel, actually completely covered the texture side, and in most cases didn't even develop on the smooth surfaces. So in terms of getting some input regarding our mix or our design from this station, there was none. But what was more important is, and I think that in this case it's taking and use your failure or results, is understand how you don't want to design structure there because of it's such a disturbed environment, and invasive species actually, if you want to reduce their effect, you should go into the very, very smooth and start to explore how not to provide them with a habitat. Because in this case, after almost 2 years of testing, we saw 2 species, and the entire community was based on 2 different mussels, the zebra mussel and the quag mussel. Regarding the biomass, we didn't find any consistent trend in terms of organic matter. But we saw significant differences in the inorganic matter and the calcium carbonate that accumulate on the different tiles and on the different surfaces. We saw that concrete composition affect the inorganic layer, where Portland cement had the lowest than all the other matrices. We saw that month post deployment, this layer is actually growing with time. And at some area we saw that peaked, or let's say leveled, after almost 3 years. In other, after 3 years, it still was increasing. And in terms of marine environment, tropical environments had less calcium carbonate deposition than temperature, which is quite predictable because of the growth of different organisms that compose calcium carbonate in those different habitats. In the tropical is more coral-based, and in the temperate is more oyster and mussel-based. So just as a conclusion for this, we saw that slight modification in composition, texture, and microdesign can affect the biology, and you need to know where and how to place a structure. Like Louise said, we found the same thing. If you want to get enhanced ecosystem services, that need to be designed according, in this case, to the area and to the species that, that are available. It's what we call in the soup out there of larvae. But it's something that you need to consider. And I think the most important is the contribution to the structural stability and operation lifespan. You need to connect. In order to go for the next phase, it was very important for us to show that the layer of biology that have the benefits in terms of ecology, and for us as ecology is the most important, also contribute to the structure, because this was the gap that we wanted to close and completely make it clear during this process, so we can take the step up for a large project. And this was our first large project implementation. This is a breakwater, which is made of stone and a concrete layer, which is an armor units. And what we did in this project, a section of the breakwater, the units which are below mean low water were replaced by units made by our mixes and our design, and the same size, the same quantity in terms of structural performance than the standard performance that you see on the top. And we tested, and we're still monitoring this project now. It's 3.5 years in the water. What we found is that biodiversity and species richness doubled on the modified antiferous. Antiferous are the units, the units that are made, that are designed for that project. And the antiferous had a significantly lower ratio of invasive species, which is very, very important in our region. East Mediterranean is suffering for a huge invasion of tropical species into the East Mediterranean, and we actually were able to show that we can tilt the ratio. We're actually just doing that by opening the substrate for competition, so different species can compete on the same space. Our next work was on another project that we did in New York. In this case, tide pools that were discussed earlier. And the second phase, those were precast concrete that we integrated into a reprep zone. And the second phase of this project was actually encapsulating wooden piles that need to be a structural support to support a pier in Brooklyn waterfront. And the same results actually came up also in the cold water of the Hudson, of the East River. We saw increase in biodiversity. We saw species that were missing and were not found earlier. And we saw that they're incorporating different niches and through small modification to the substrate can promote better and more diverse ecology. I think the most important thing from our side is, if we want to take the gap and go and start actually changing the way waterfronts are looking worldwide, we need to go hand in hand with the industry. We need to provide the industry, as scientists, we need to provide the industry with techniques and materials that can be widely used and can be easily accepted by the standard that they're working according to. And by doing that, we can actually harnessing infrastructure for biological and ecological benefits and get benefits of bioprotection. And with that, I think I'm going into and moving on to moving this to Alex.
Can you guys see me? So Dave, I think, did you want to speak first?
Yep, can you hear me?
Yep.
Everybody hear me? Okay, thanks, Ido. So, yeah, my name's David Lennon, and Alex and I are going to be partnering on this. So this is going to be a nice wrap-up, because we've had some great talks now on the science and the engineering, and what Reef Design Lab brings to this process is what we feel completes the puzzle, and that's the design aspect. So a big part of my life building artificial reefs since 1991, and I've actually, Reef Design Lab is my 4th artificial reef company, and that's because as I started building artificial reefs, and I originally started building them out of just junk material, I started to gain an appreciation for how marine life used constructed materials in the marine environment, an appreciation for how we really needed to build better. And we were putting some really ugly stuff in the sea, and my companies evolved, and then by good fortune, I met the amazing designer, Alex here, my business partner, and that completed the puzzle, because we had the science, we had the engineering, but we lacked the design aspect, because one of the facts is it's humans that buy these products. So we believe they need to look aesthetically pleasing. And also when you look at the beauty of nature and how nature is designed, it's incredible. So to mimic nature, we need the science, the engineering, and the design aspect. So on the screen now, there's just some examples of some of our structures, and what we're aiming for is that more organic, natural look. And if you can go to the next slide, Alex. And I'm going to discuss, share our driving principle that we use in all our design work, and we call it protective space. Did you change the screen, Alex? Great.
I'm on micro protective space.
The key principle that we use in all our design work is this understanding of protective space. And by protective space, I mean it's appreciating how everything from a bacteria, the algae, the coral larvae, the crabs, the sea urchins, the fish, they're all looking for protective space. And protective space ranges on 5 different scales, at least how we look at it, from the microscopic, and so the microscopic is the scale where we can't see it with our naked eye, and we can't really feel it. And in the pictures here, you'll see where we've treated the underwater structure with a glaze. So that protective space is minimalized on the bald part of the sculpture, and on the other side it was slightly rougher, and you can see the difference in colonization. And that's what we call the micro. And then we go up to the surface level of protective space. If the slide changes. We're now getting larger. So this is a bit like your fingerprint. We can start to feel, we can start to see this level of protective space. And whenever we design anything, we do what we call, we Articiaial it. We look at any curve, any straight line, and we think about how can we add more protective space to that structure. So now we're looking at the surface roughness basically. And next slide. And thinking like a marine animal, they're looking for protection from predation, from currents. In the intertidal area, they're looking for protection from sunlight and drying out, and protection from each other. Now, moving up, we've got protective space on the actual unit. So if we're looking at a reef unit or the seawall tiles that were built for the World Harbour project, we're getting bigger now, and there's bigger gaps. So these are the sort of gaps that might be centimeters or even tens of centimeters. And that's where you'll get your crabs, your fish, urchins, or abalone, for example, will hide in them at night. So we're moving up, and then from the unit protective space, we go larger again, and we get into the inter-unit protective space. So here you can see some of our new triangular tiles. Now, if we butted those tiles up against each other, we've missed an opportunity to create protective space. So by putting gaps between the tiles, that will actually increase the usable area. Now, like Ido was saying, in some applications, you don't want, this can encourage invasive species, and that's why some studies are important. And the research that's being done is, helps us understand this. But the gaps between the units, think of it as the roads in a city. We need roads, we need laneways, and it's the same when you're putting reefs together. And one of the biggest problems I've seen in reefs around the world is people putting their reef units too far apart, so there isn't enough creative space, protective space. So one of our rules of thumb when it becomes down to putting reef units together is not to put them further away than 2 times the diameter of the reef unit. So, for example, in the bottom right there, you can see the concrete reef balls. If they've got a diameter of 1 meter on the base, we don't put them more than 2 meters apart to the next one. Otherwise, the protective space is diminished. It's a bit like if you build a town and you had 100 meters between the houses, it wouldn't be a very vibrant town. So now that's protective space between units, and then it goes even bigger into tens or hundreds of meters, and you've got the protective space between actual reefs. And that's a bit like the open park areas in a city, or those gaps between cities. It's important space that fish and other things can move between and seek protection from. So that's our underlying principle that we look and consider in all of our design work, is the protective space. And then Alex is going to talk a bit more now about the actual design part.
All right, thanks, Dave. Look, sorry, guys, we've got a bit of a lag with the images, so you'll have to just bear with us. So my name's Alex Goad. I'm also a co-founder of Reef Design Lab, and I did industrial design at uni. So look, I'm kind of the odd one out with all of this. I really come from this as, you know, a designer from a design point of view. So my interests really lie in, you know, 3D printing, 3D modeling, fabrication, and different sort of composite materials and that sort of thing. But this is really a fascinating area for, I think, everyone involved here, and a huge opportunity to take advantage of. The World Harbour project tiles that a lot of you have all been sent, the way we designed that, you know, we just used simple CAD modeling techniques. And then Sydney Institute of Marine Science chose a design, and then we 3D printed it and made a mold of that, and then produced all the tiles. So what I found so fascinating as a designer was we were able to, designers sort of are always, you know, 3D printing's the big thing at the moment, but everyone's always obsessing over how to get the, you know, the best quality 3D print. But with what we're doing with EocEngineering, we're actually looking for like the worst quality 3D print. So, you know, we sort of played around with, you know, kind of hacked our 3D printer to try to get it to print, you know, really bad quality so that we could produce this sort of weird texture that Dave was talking about to do with protected space to get maximizing colonization. So, I mean, from my point of view, this is all just absolutely fascinating, you know, bringing science and design together, and just a huge opportunity to, I think, you know, engage people around the world with this sort of work. I mean, the collaborative opportunities, I think, are absolutely massive here to engage, you know, educational institutions, you know, looking at design and science, sort of combining it all together is just absolutely fantastic. It's been great to be a part of it. I think hopefully you can see on the screen now, you can see some of our triangular designs, and what I think is so awesome with the 3D printing is we're able to prototype new designs really, really quickly. So I mean, we've been going back and forth with Sydney Institute of Marine Science, and they've been, you know, requesting all these sort of design elements. I think up in the top right, a really small mini 3D printed rock pool, you know, to go on the wall. I mean, it's a bit embarrassing, I think, compared to Ido's massive rock pools, but you kind of get the idea. And I think it was really interesting as well what Louise said about, you know, even really small rock pools can make a difference. So we're trialing a whole lot of different sort of things there. But something we found, one of the biggest issues with the World Harbour project tiles was it's really not economical or practical for everyone to, you know, bolt all these 3D printed tiles to a wall one by one. So what I wanted to present to you now was just a way that we've looked at how we could really sort of quicken up this whole process and have the ability to trial multiple different designs and that sort of thing. So instead of, you know, connecting tiles individually, what we thought would be really cool would to be create this kind of like almost like an architectural marine textile sort of thing to retrofit different types of marine infrastructure. So what we've done is we've got all our, you know, various designs that, you know, is a collaborative effort between all of you scientists and the design team. And we've used it into this specialized composite plastic mesh, or in some circumstances steel mesh, depending on the environment, that sort of thing. And what we then created is a really easy way to quickly retrofit marine infrastructure. And obviously, you know, seawalls aren't always going to be flat, so this gives us the opportunity to retrofit really obscure seawalls, and then also, you know, things like we were asked to help retrofit, you know, these massive sea bags that they use for wave control and erosion control and that sort of thing. And another issue that the council was having with one of these sea bags was people were coming up to the sea bags with knives and slashing the bag. It's just, you know, stupid vandalism. But our meshes, the concept is that the meshes will obviously provide habitat, but then also provide protection for the actual sandbag itself. And then also things like retrofitting pylons and that sort of thing, like Ido was talking about as well. So I think all these different design techniques as well, you know, might suit certain areas more than others. I think perhaps this design that we're talking about might not be so suited to, you know, seawalls that are experiencing really heavy wave action and that sort of thing. But hopefully what you can see now is an example of how the textile would work and the variations that it could provide. So what we were also working with was that even if you had a completely flat seawall, we could incorporate posts and areas that could push this textile out to create all those variations from the wall, obviously adding more diversity to the seawall environment. And also with this textile, we're obviously not limited to just, you know, triangular tiles. I mean, we can do a huge variety of things, you know, different types of tile designs, you know, larger ones, small ones, again, working with as much diversity as possible, or really, I mean, whatever, you know, the scientific requirements are for the marine infrastructure that's being retrofitted. So we think it's a really exciting, I mean, we think everything that we're doing here is really, really exciting. And this was just one example that we're working on at the moment, but I mean, we're taking a lot of the knowledge from the World Harbour Project and a lot of these sort of concepts, and working with, you know, hanging marine hanging habitats and a variety of other things. So yeah, no, it's a really, really we're really really happy to be a part of all of this. And I think what's so important from my point of view with the design side of things is, I think for your average person looking at these sort of things, if you can really create, you know, a bit of a sort of like a habitat story, I think you can engage people really well. I think unfortunately human beings often take sort of note of the marine environment when it's colonizing a man-made thing. I think, you know, shipwrecks are a good example of that, like Louise said earlier. So it's, yeah, this is really, really exciting work, and we're really excited to be a part of it. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. So thank you very much to our three speakers. So what I'd like to do now is open it up to about 5 or 10 minutes of question time. And I guess there's two ways that you, the audience, can ask questions. So first of all, I see that there have already been a few questions that people have typed through, which is great. That can kickstart our question session. The other thing that you can do, so hopefully on your side panel, you can see a little hand icon, and so that's basically just sticking your hand up if you have a question to ask, and what we can do is unmute you, and then you can actually physically ask the question yourself. So I guess while people are sticking their hands up, I'll start with the ones that have come through so far. So Carol Brighton has a question to Ido, and so Carol's question is, are the cement matrices as strong as Portland concrete?
Yeah, everything is in line with the requirements of concrete for the marine construction, for the marine industry. We didn't test anything that is not complying with that. So it means that in terms of compression forces, tensile forces, density, aggregate, cracking, air for freeze and thaw issues, everything comply with the requirements, and we started with that. So, but in order to make this next phase and going into actual implementation in large projects much easier. So from the beginning, we started with concrete mixes that are complying with all the requirements, and it's different between states and between area. So we did a pool of tests that we run on all the matrices, so we can comply with the different requirements.
Right, so Carol has another question, but before we get to that, I can see that Taz Crow also has one. So we will unmute you, Taz, and ask your question.
Hi, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Hi, so I'm interested in this idea of essentially trying to reduce the favorability of the engineering and adjustment that we make for invasive species relative to native species. And there are several points raised that caught my interest in that regard. So Ida in particular, you're finding about the smooth surfaces really being not a strong settlement surface in the Great Lakes. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? How general was that finding in the other studies that you did? And was of the few species that were settling on those smoother surfaces, what was the relative abundance of natives and invasives?
So first of all, addressing the Great Lakes are one of the most disturbed environments we ever encountered. So there was a complete shift of the biology there, and the community completely changed since the invasion of the zebra mussel. So, for example, at that point, as I stated, we saw 2 species for 3 years, and all the infrastructure that is getting into the water is completely getting covered by those species, which is costing the industry billions and billions of dollars for just maintaining the infrastructure in the Great Lakes. So in that case, it was a good example of if you want to create a structure, you need to address the environment that you're going to put in there. So in the Great Lakes, I will not try to promote biodiversity because we didn't encounter any biodiversity. There's 2 species that are so dominant. I wouldn't do anything to promote them. I think that the damage that they're doing is much higher than actually promoting them. So in that case, you can implement smooth surfaces. Regarding other places like tropical environments or temperate environments, that's the reason we separated the experiments. The lab experiments was actually testing only material and not complexity. And the testing that we did in the sea tested both. You definitely see a change between smooth surfaces, but if you and textured surfaces. But if you compare smooth surfaces, both in the lab and in the sea, of different matrices and Portland cement base, you can also see a change. So it's a balance between texture and material properties. In different environments, we think, we're not completely sure, that this is not, there's change between them. Some places complexity is more important, in other places the properties of the material, of the substrate is more important. But even if you compare smooth surfaces, you can see a difference. And we even in places where we work in project and we're required for smooth surfaces, because usually it's because of construction restrictions, we prefer going into working with the tested matrices and making sure that we address the smooth surfaces in the micro level. So in micro bubbles, in micro niches, we usually do that through applying chemicals on the concrete while it's cast.
Great, thanks very much.
Great, thank you. So I think, Karen, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you. It's Karen from Sydney. I had a question for Louise. You presented 3 options. Is there an option which you would recommend as a preferred method?
So yeah, we've obviously three different options. I guess it really depends on the goal. What are you trying to do? And also, I guess, given the fact that two of those options involved concrete, unlike Ido, we just used regular concrete. We didn't treat it in any way to make it environmentally friendly. Cost, of course, is another consideration as well. The Bioblock, for one, certainly is a relatively expensive option, whereas the other two are really cheap. So if cost was a consideration, the Bioblock could be out. For example, like the Bioblock on its own, we only had one. I will put my hand up and say N=1 is a rubbish experiment, but we certainly pitched it as a demonstration project rather than a fully replicated proper experiment. It was an expensive experiment. All in, it was about £2,000 just for one unit. So that would be an expensive option. If, like Dave and Alex, you had a company that was able to mass produce these things, it gets cheaper the more units you produce. But certainly we would need a company to get on board in order to do that before it could become cheaper. Both the concrete pools and the drill pools were really, really cheap options. And I guess it would depend really a case of did you want to use concrete or not. They both had quite similar outcomes, I would say. So it would be a case of whether you wanted to use concrete or not.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, so we've got another question from Carol Brighton, and so I might actually direct this one to Beth Strain if she's still on the line. Beth is our postdoctoral fellow who's been running our global experiments for the World Harbour Project. So the other question Carol's asking is, are all the members of Working Group 2 experimenting with the same Reef Design Lab tiles, and are they using the same methodology? So, Beth, if you're there, I don't know if you want to...
Yes. Hi, yes, I'm here. So the answer to that is yes, it's a global experiment. So we did try to just use the same design and the same materials and the same methods so far as possible. Obviously, there's been slight modifications depending on if people have availability to the bivalves or not.
Yeah, so one of the design that we are using for those people that aren't involved was actually one that David and Alex showed in their presentation. They're square tiles that have crevices and ridges in them. And so the idea with this is that we were interested in trialling the efficacy of this type of habitat provision under different environmental conditions. So several of the speakers tonight talked about how in tropical environments and in temperate environments, often the species respond quite differently to the introduction of these artificial structures. So we've been really interested in the question of, you know, what works well in the temperate environment. Does it actually work well in the tropical environment as well? So do we have any other questions out there? Either raising your hand or typing a question. No? Okay, well, we might wrap it up then. So I'd like to thank everyone very much for their time this evening or this morning. So first of all, to our four presenters for really interesting presentations that have all covered different aspects of eco-engineering and, you know, I guess from the design process right through to the implementation, the materials perspective as well. And I'd like to thank all of you online for participating in the session and for your interest and enthusiasm. So thank you very much.
Thank you.